Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. I'm back out in my vegetable garden today because it's time for the second part of my video on how to grow cool season crops. Now in last week's video I gave you some background. It was still a little too early to plant things, but today is planting day, so I'm very excited. Before we get started, I wanted to show you my garden layout. I always do one every year. And I apologize for the fact that it's in pencil, but every now and then I do need to make some changes, so it helps to have something that I can erase. But this is where the entrance to the garden is, and it's also where that hedge is. So usually what I do is I plant all of my cool season crops in this first row of raised beds, because in the mid to late afternoon, these beds get a bit of a shadow cast on them from the hedge. And so I take advantage of the fact that most cool season crops will tolerate a bit of shade, and that's why I put them there. In this first bed, I'm growing beets and chard, but mostly beets because we discovered last winter that we didn't grow enough of them, and we absolutely love them, especially roasted. Next is going to be leeks and onions. Both of those will be seedlings. Now you've already seen the lettuce bed, but I made a change to it last week, so I want to show you that. In this bed, I wrote down carrots and parsnips, but actually I'm growing 4 different types of carrots this year, so I think I'm going to skip the parsnips. This next bed is going to have peas in it. Those are my gutter peas, and I'm not going to plant them until next week, but this is where they're going to go. Then there is the garlic bed that also has shallots in it. That's something we planted last fall. They're doing really great, and I'll show you those in a moment. And then in this last bed, we're going to grow more onions. I even have onions going into another bed in the second row of beds, and that's because we just love onions, and we figured out a really good way to store them over the winter by putting them in a bin in our garage. I always thought they needed to be kept at a warmer temperature, but actually our garage is quite chilly during the winter months, and the onions kept great. So we're going to plant even more this year. So that's what I wanted to show you for now, although I should also mention there is a bed for broccoli here. That's another cool season crop, but my seedlings aren't large enough to transplant yet. Now that you've seen the layout of my garden, I wanted to show you what's going on in this row where I'm going to be planting today. Now first of all, this is the hedge I was talking about. It's arborvitae, and if you're wondering what those red berries are, that's from American cranberry bush, which is an amazing native shrub. But let's go through the beds because I want to explain what's going on here, and then we'll get started. This first bed is one of the onion beds. And right next to it is our garlic and shallot bed. That's something that we planted last fall. You can see the plants are up and they're growing really well. We are crazy about garlic, so we always have a big patch of them. And then right next to it is where the gutter peas are going. And that is something that you might not be familiar with, but I have a video earlier this spring that explains what it's all about, and the peas are going to be planted next week. In the next bare bed, that's where the carrots are going, and again, I'm planting 4 different varieties, which I'm really excited about. And you'll notice that the lettuce bed looks a little different, so let's check that out. If you've been following me this year, you know this is where the lettuce is planted. And I used to have a long series of row cloches over them to protect them from our very cold overnight temperatures. The main thing is I was trying to get them started as early as possible so we could get an early harvest. I may have started them a little bit too early, but they're still doing well. Well, you'll notice something looks a little different here. So this is a special row cover top over a raised bed. And it's actually a DIY project that's in my new book, The Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. So it's a hinged lid with a handle. Check this out. Is that cool or what? So floating row cover, this material on here, lets in sunlight, it lets in moisture. As a matter of fact, we had a rainstorm a couple days ago and everything got watered very nicely. It also gives plants some frost protection early or late in the season. and it also acts as a physical barrier to keep pests away from plants. Now in the case of lettuce, I have a problem with birds pecking at the leaves and just destroying my plantings. So this way I can very easily access the plants by lifting up the lid, but I can keep the birds away. And I'm also going to plant something that is susceptible to leaf miners, which are a nasty pest, and so that will also keep them away from the plants. So this is very cool, and again, a project that's in my book. And here's a peek at the lettuce plants, just in case you wanted proof that they're still doing well. Here's the last two beds in this first row. The one that's closer to you is where the leeks and onions will be planted, and the bed on the far right is where the beets and a few Swiss chard are going. You'll also notice on the far end of the bed that there is part of a row cloche system that I was using over the lettuce, just so you know what I was talking about. And just because I know some of you are probably wondering, these white pipes that are on the sides of the beds are 10-inch lengths of PVC pipe that is 1 inch in diameter. And we use them as supports for the 1/2-inch diameter hoops that we use on most of our beds in order to hold floating row cover or bird netting. So I just wanted you to know what those were there for. Since we rotate our crops every year, we decided to put the pipes on the outsides of the beds. I know they're not beautiful to look at, but that way, no matter what bed I plant something in, if it needs some type of cover over it, it's ready to go at a moment's notice. I thought I would start with carrots first because I have some interesting tips to share with you that will hopefully make you have great success in growing them. So we're growing 4 different types this year, and they're all ones that I have not grown before. This one is Uzbek Golden. It's supposed to be super sweet. Then there is Tonda di Parigi, Danvers 126, and New Kuroda. You'll also notice I have some labels here because when you're trying to see how something performs, unless it really stands out, which actually these first 2 would, you really want to label your plantings so you can later evaluate how well they did. As I mentioned last week, when you're growing carrots, it's really important that you don't add a lot of high nitrogen soil amendments to the bed, and that's because they will make the carrots fork and split. You do not want that. However, they will benefit from the addition of some bone meal. Bone meal is an organic soil amendment. It is high in phosphorus. That's the middle number on packages of fertilizer. And what phosphorus does is it promotes good, strong root development, and certainly you need that with carrots. It also promotes blooming and the setting of fruit on other types of crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, melons, squash, and so on. So it's a really great organic amendment to have on hand. Now our beds here are 3 feet wide by 8 feet long, so that's 24 square feet. And that has made it really easy for adding things to the soil, even though I don't add much, because usually a fertilizer package will give you proportions based on 100 square feet. Well, I don't have 100 square feet, but I roughly have a quarter of that. So I read the label on the package, which is something you should always do, and I determined that about a cup of bone meal would be sufficient to help the carrots grow. So that's what I'm going to do. I do a lot of cooking, so I know about how much a cup is just by pouring it out here. So there's about a quarter of a cup. My scientific measurements. So I'm just sprinkling on the bed. As you can see, I think I was a little short over here. And then I'm just going to rake it in with an iron rake. There we go. So that's about a cup. Even though we just had a rainstorm a couple days ago, you can see a lot of the surface soil is really quite dry. And we don't have the drip irrigation system turned on just yet, hopefully in about a week. So I'm going to have to hand water this in, but I can manage. And I'm going to put the drip system back in place because, first of all, I don't want to disturb the plantings later, and also it gives me a nice straight line for making my rows. Now I'll just use the handle of the iron rake to make a little furrow that is more or less straight along the drip line. I have a terrible time doing things in a straight line. It's a personal problem I have. Now carrots only need to be covered by 1/4 inch of soil. That's not much at all. So I need to keep that in mind as I'm planting them. So that's what carrot seeds look like. And I'm just going to sprinkle the seeds in, not super thickly. And an important thing that's going to happen is once the seedlings are about 3 inches tall, I'm going to space them so they're just about 3 inches apart. And that's because you want to leave enough room between the plants so that the carrots will have room to develop a good root. One other thing I want to mention about that is that you cannot transplant, or should not transplant, the seedlings that you thin out. And that's because it will damage the root tips. And what happens with carrots is that they will not form properly if the tips of their roots have been damaged. So sadly, you're just going to have to put them into your compost pile. Next up is to just barely cover the seeds. Remember, just 1/4 inch of soil. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pat the soil down so it makes good contact with the seeds, and then I'm going to water them in. That is really important. Now, while I'm letting the water soak into the soil, I wanted to explain the next step that is unique to carrots, and you're going to think this is nuts, but it's so worth it. So it's called the board method. After you have planted and watered in your carrot seeds, there is a problem that occurs this time of year. The soil forms a crust on it because if you think about springtime weather, it's a beautiful sunny day like today, so it's kind of dry. Then maybe you have a rainstorm, the soil is wet, and then it gets dry and beautiful again. Not that I'm complaining. And what happens through all of those changes in weather is that you get this crust of soil. Well, carrot seedlings are tiny things. They're really wimpy. And so they have a hard time pushing through the soil if that crust is on the surface. So if you place just scrap boards over your planting rows and leave them there for about a week to 10 days, that will prevent the crust from forming. Then you remove the boards and then just grow them as you normally would. So it's an extra step. Fortunately, we have a lot of scrap lumber around, so it's not hard for me to do, but it's definitely worth it, especially if you've had a really tough time getting a decent germination from your carrot seeds. And you just want to kind of press them down onto the soil so they make good contact with it. I'm sure you'll agree that it's not pretty, but it's a temporary situation, and then you can get back to normal carrot growing. Okay, let's plant the beet and Swiss chard bed. And as I mentioned earlier, it's primarily going to be beets, but we still want some Swiss chard plants. Now for beets, our all-time favorite variety is cylindrical, also called cylindra. And for Swiss chard, I like rainbow blend or bright lights. And that's because they're just so beautiful. Look at the colors of those stalks. Wow. Now, one thing that I really like about Swiss chard is that it is much more heat tolerant than spinach. I can grow Swiss chard for the entire growing season without any problems. Whereas with spinach, once the summertime temperatures start heating up, they will bolt to seed. So I typically grow spinach during the fall and winter months because of that. Now I've found that beets and Swiss chard do not have a whole lot of needs as far as nutrients and special care. They just grow so easily. So I'm just going to go ahead and make the furrows and then get the seeds planted. One thing I wanted to point out about beet and Swiss chard seeds is that, first of all, they look the same. That's because they're in the same plant family. And second of all, they are actually clusters of seeds. But the great news is you do not need to separate them. Now I only planted a half row of Swiss chard. Now these seeds are quite a bit larger than the carrot seeds, and because of that, they're going to be covered by roughly ½ an inch of soil. And then once I get these planted, I have a very important tip to share with you. It's a bit of a pain watering things by hand, but this is a short-term problem. Okay, so what is it I wanted to share with you? Well, beets, spinach, and Swiss chard are all members of the beet family, basically. And all of them are susceptible to a particularly nasty insect. It's called the leaf miner, and the adult is a fly. It lays eggs on the leaves of the plants. The maggots, hatch, and they tunnel through the leaves, leaving their excrement and doing a whole lot of damage. There is no way you're going to want to harvest the leaves to eat, right? Fortunately, there is such an easy solution to this problem, and that is to place a layer of floating row cover over the bed. It will prevent the spinach leaf miner fly, the adult, from landing on the leaves of the plants and laying their eggs. So easy. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to put hoops over this bed, and I am going to put some floating row cover over the top. It's so important that you do this as soon as you plant your seeds. Now, none of these crops have to be pollinated, so that means you can leave the bed covered for the entire season other than to maybe weed or to harvest. Here's all the hoops. Now you can see those white pipes in action. I've got one end of this bundled together with a rubber band, kind of like a ponytail. So there's one end. And then I'm bundling together this other end, definitely weighting it down with a piece of wood, because first of all, you can see it's a breezy day. This would be off in a heartbeat if I didn't do that. And second of all, I'm going to weight it down in a few spots because I don't want any gaps where those sneaky leaf miner flies can get in. Now you can see it all set up. And one thing I wanted to mention is that floating row cover will last for years if you are careful with it. And even if I do get a small hole in it, I just take a clothespin, pinch the fabric together, and leave the pin in place, and that prevents any types of critters from getting in. So this is the onion and leek bed, which is going to be a little bit different type of a setup. But once I get this planted, you'll have seen everything you need to see today to get started. Bill and I started leeks and onions from seed indoors a few weeks ago. With the leeks, I'm going to plant one plant per hole. And what Bill did with these red torpedo onions, which are a small cylindrical onion rather than one of the ones that bulbs, is in each cell of this pony pack, he planted a couple of seeds. And so what he wants me to do is to plant the contents of a cell in a planting hole. So in this case, 2 plants in the same hole, and then one will be harvested early on as basically like a green onion, and then the other will have room remaining in that planting hole to develop a nice onion. I hope that makes sense. You'll see what I'm doing in a few minutes. With the leeks, which are also members of the onion family, they get planted rather unusually. If you think about leeks that you've purchased at the grocery store, they have that long stem that is white, and it's so tasty. And so what you do with leeks is you plant them in the bottom of a trench. It doesn't have to be super deep, but then as they grow, you keep filling in soil around them. But you never want the soil to go into the little nook where a leaf is emerging from the stem, so it always should be right below that. So these ones I need to plant in a trench and fill in the soil as they grow, and these ones, the contents of each individual cell are going to go into a single planting hole, and we'll harvest half of the onions early on and then let the other ones mature. Okay, let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is to make the trench on one side of the bed because I only have enough seedlings to go into a single trench, which is actually kind of nice. And so I'm just temporarily putting the soil into a wheelbarrow. Okay, the trench is made, and I did work a bit of bone meal into the bottom of the trench and also into the rest of the bed so that the leeks and the onions will benefit from it. Garlic and shallots also benefit from bone meal. The next thing I need to do is to put this drip system back into place. I'd rather do it now than risk injuring some of the little plants. Now I'm going to use this wooden dibber tool in order to plant the leeks in the bottom of the trench. If you haven't seen this before, I recently shot a video that's called Susan's Essential Garden Tools, and you'll understand better what this is and where it comes from. So I'm just going to make a hole with the dibber. Sometimes they're called a dibble. Here's my nice little leek seedling, and I'm going to plant it in the bottom of the trench where the top of this soil is even with the bottom of the trench. And I'm going to plant them about 5 inches apart. Now I always say don't pull out by the stem, and that probably looked like that's what I just did, but they are so loose I'm just guiding it out of the individual cell. There, see? I'm not grabbing it, pinching it, and being rough with it. As you can see, these are really easy to plant. It's just that you got to make the trench. Now, since some of them aren't cooperating about coming out of their little cell, I'm going to use my trusty slot screwdriver, and I just slipped it in along the outer edge of the root ball, and then I'm gently taking it out. That worked better. Okay, now all of the leeks are planted. I do have a few more coming that I started using the winter sowing method, and yes, there's a video for that too. And they're just not quite large enough, so I'm going to let them grow a little bit longer, and then I'll fill out the end of this trench. So I was telling you about the onions that Bill planted. This is the contents of one cell of the pony pack, and they're going to get planted together in a single hole. You can see why I like this dibber so much, because you just push it in, make a little hole, and in go the plants. Okay, I'm going to get the rest of these onions planted. There's going to be 2 rows. I might have more than I need, but I have another bed that's getting onions as well. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. I really appreciate it. I hope there were some interesting tips that you picked up along the way. I'll see you next week. And before I go, this is just a friendly reminder that I have a brand new book coming out, the Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. I wrote it for all levels of gardeners, from beginners to master gardeners. This will help you identify both the good bugs and the bad bugs in your garden, and provide you with all sorts of methods for dealing with the bad ones using effective organic controls. This is going to be such a great resource for all gardeners. If you pre-order it now, you will receive special bonus content that is not in the book and can't be found elsewhere. It contains my best tips for growing your favorite veggies, and some you might not have thought of. All you have to do is order it from your bookstore or preferred online source and email me your order confirmation. My email address is susan@susansinthegarden.com. Then I'll send you a link to the bonus content. This is a great deal, and thank you.